The headlines warned, killer hurricane coming. Many people along the Gulf and East Coast of our country hear warnings like this periodically, and many of them choose to stay and ride out the hurricane because they're tough, kind of like the old John Wayne movies, I guess. Often when people hear of potentially catastrophic things coming their way, they doubt that it will really be as bad as they say. And like I said, people think they can ride out a killer hurricane. People in California are sure that the big one will never hit. That proverbial 9 to 10 point earthquake. There's a part of us in our human nature that finds it hard to believe catastrophic warnings, regardless of where they come from. Be it Noah about it, not the biblical Noah, but the organization Noah relative to a hurricane coming or tornadoes coming, or even if we got to the point where we could forecast earthquakes, we would still have a tendency to, it's not going to be as bad as they say. We always look for the best. There's a part of us that finds it hard to believe catastrophe is coming. And as Christians, I don't think we are really immune to this. We're not immune to doubting. I think we may find ourselves questioning of all the things we've studied in our series on Daniel and the book of Revelation are really, really going to happen. I mean, it's been 2,000 years since Jesus left. Do I really think Jesus is going to come in my lifetime? And we have a tendency to kind of think, well, yeah, I know the Bible talks about these things we've been studying prophetically, but I'm not so sure it's going to take place in my lifetime. It's kind of what Peter talks about in 1 Peter, that in the end days, they will say, where is the promise of His coming? All things continue as they've always been. I think as Christians we have a hard time believing that prophecy is going to unfold, and perhaps the time of the end may be close. This morning, as we are coming to conclusion really on this series on prophecy, I want to look at a couple of reasons why I believe that these things are going to take place that we've studied. Not only take place, but why I believe that we may be on the threshold of their beginning. Now, we're going to be in Daniel chapter 12 this morning, and if you have your Bible, you might want to turn there. We actually are not going to conclude this morning. We're going to look at Daniel 12, and next week I want to do a summary review of all that we've studied in this series of Daniel and Revelation. But this morning we're going to be looking at where we are. Many of the prophecies of Daniel describe events that were future for Daniel, but are now history for us. Many of them are. We can look back at prophetical passages like Daniel chapter 11 that have such incredible detailed history involved in them, and compare them with history as it was written, as it actually unfolded. And I think fulfilled prophecy really verifies the Bible as a supernatural book. I have believed that from the very early days of my Christian life when I was exposed to the prophetical teachings of Scripture. And only God can write history before it happens. And so as we come this morning and looking at these things, we're going to be looking at a couple, I believe, warnings that God gives us in Daniel chapter 12. And if the Bible is accurate on things written in this history in the past that have already taken place, then we can count with pretty strong credence that the things that have not yet happened will come to pass, will come to take place. Bible teachers 70, 80 years ago were ridiculed for believing that Israel would be reborn as a nation. And yet for many of us in our lifetimes, in mine as a small infant, but in our lifetimes nonetheless, we saw Israel reborn in 1948, May 14th. Some of you remember those headlines and the radio reports. The establishment of Israel in 1948 is a warning sign that God's clock is ticking. And it's ticking down to the final 7 years as we've studied prophecy. And in Daniel 12, we have two more warning indicators that God's plan for the future is near, or nearer, perhaps I should say. These indicators are like a flashing orange light on your dashboard. If you have in your car an orange light that comes on and begins blinking at you, that probably indicates to you, and if you have the wisdom, you will know you should probably pull over and find out what's wrong with your car before you fry your engine. Or if you were a nuclear power plant operator and you saw a flashing orange light on the console, you would know that there was something to come, and you would pay attention. And so that's where we are this morning in Daniel chapter 12. And I want to begin by looking, we're going to take this a little bit out of order this morning, starting at verse 4. Daniel chapter 12 and verse 4. And we're going to look at really the latter part of that verse first of all. But I'll read the whole text here and we'll look at it on the screen as well. But you, Daniel, close up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge. And in this last part of verse 4, we have two concepts that I want to take some time to look at that I believe are warning indicators that the time of the end is near. The angel tells Daniel, many will go here and there to increase knowledge. And there's two concepts there. Now I want to begin with this first part of this phrase, many will go here and there. Most Bible commentators take this to be a warning sign to mean that travel will increase toward the end of days, toward the end of time. Now, travel has always been part of mankind's lot. From the days of Noah, to try and put a little bit of humor in here, he did some traveling, to the time of Abraham, all the way up to the present, humanity has traveled. But, you know, it was interesting. At the time when Jules Verne wrote Around the World in 80 Days, about 125 some odd years ago in 1873, to go around the planet in 80 days was considered to be fantasy by most of the population of the planet. Unheard of, unthinkable. That's a phenomenal thought. 125 years ago it was fantasy to go around the world in 80 days. The International Space Station does it every 90 minutes today. My grandmother, who lived to be 101, was born in 1896. She remembered, as a small child, hearing about the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk in 1903. 6 years of age. My grandmother saw from the very first airplanes to a lunar landing in the last 100 years. That's phenomenal to think about. 100 years is a short time period in the history of humanity. Contextually, it seems like this verse here in 12:4 is really talking, though, about traveling to and fro to gain knowledge and understanding. And contextually, I think the purpose of the travel that the angel is telling Daniel about is not just to go traveling for traveling's sake, as some like to do. It's not to go traveling just to become more aware of what's in our world. But I think contextually Daniel is being told that this travel will be to try and find out what's involved in God's plans. If you have your Bible, go from Daniel over a few pages, go past Hosea, Joel, to the little book of Amos. Amos chapter 8. Amos 8, and I want to look at verse 12. The prophet Amos here, he says this in Amos 8:12. Men will stagger from sea to sea and wander from north to east, searching for the word of the Lord, but they will not find it. And a number of Bible commentators take what Amos is saying here, how in the end days people will be searching for truth. They may not even know what the truth is they're looking for. But that this truth that they are looking for, the word of the Lord, may be part of what Daniel is being told will be unfolding in the end of days. The bottom line is there will be moving about, people trying to discover what's going on. And part of the purpose is for the understanding of knowledge. The understanding of knowledge. And so secondly, in 12:4, we see that this travel will lead to an increasing understanding of things, of knowledge in general. And the last 75 years has been a time of an explosion of knowledge, to say the least. Today, there is more scientific discovery in 1 year, the experts tell us, than used to take place in a whole 100 years. Every year, the amount of scientific discovery is absolutely phenomenal. The Barna Research Group, writing in 1991. Now, that's an important year, 1991. Do you know what did not exist in 1991? The Internet. Well, it existed for military and scientific purposes, but for the public use, the Internet did not exist in 1991. That wasn't so long ago, was it? The Internet really came on the scene in 1992. Now, with that understanding, I want you to see what the Barna Group said. 1991, they wrote this. Although we have an incredible amount of information available already, the volume is just 3% of what we will have at our fingertips in 2010. A year later, it was more than 3%, it was 3,000-fold. Other writers and researchers have said, they are telling us that there is going to have another information explosion in the next 20 years. I talk with our resident computer guru, Gene, periodically, and we reminisce about the early days of computers having, 64 bytes of memory. and then they went to gigs, and now they're talking about terabytes. Billions of bytes of memory in a computer. It's incredible. Most of you know I use the Internet very regularly. Not a day goes by I do not use the Internet. I use it for my news. I check a number of national news sources every morning when I get up. I check the news there. And I use the Internet in my study. The Internet has become an integral part of my study. Even when it comes to biblical words and phrases. As I'm working on a message, if I want to find out, this week I wanted to reference Jules Verne, Around the World in 80 Days. Well, I didn't have to go in the other room and dig out the old encyclopedias that we bought at the grocery store back in, how long ago was that? I don't know. They're very out of date, but some stuff never changes too. I didn't have to go to the encyclopedia and dig that out. I typed in online Around the World in 80 Days, and here I found that he wrote that in 1873. Most of the graphics I use in my PowerPoint presentation, all of them come off a line. I can type in a word, a biblical word, or a biblical phrase, or a biblical passage on the Internet, and I can get all kinds of information. I can get in 0.89 seconds, according to Google, I can get more information than I would spend hours unraveling in my own personal library. It's phenomenal. What I have available to me at my fingertips, it is well more than what the Barna Group ever imagined in 1991 I would have. Last Saturday afternoon, a week ago yesterday, our refrigerator has a pull-out bottom drawer freezer on the bottom, and the handle was loose. And it's bugged me for a number of weeks, months actually. And I finally, Saturday afternoon, it bothered me so much, I thought, I've got to do something about this loose handle. But I looked at I pulled the drawer out. There's no screw holes on the inside to tighten that hand. That would have seemed the logical place to put. I looked underneath. There was no little set screws or Allen wrenches underneath to tighten the handle up. And it was obvious you had to do something with that handle. You had to snap it or slide it, but I had no way of knowing what to do without breaking it. So I went in on the computer. I typed in on Google the name of the brand of our refrigerator and the problem I was having. And like that, I had a whole list of solutions to solve that loose handle on the freezer drawer. Less than a minute, I had the answer. 5 minutes later, it was done. It was tight. You can't get a repairman that quick. It's amazing what we have available to us, information-wise. And as I said, it goes well beyond just biblical information. Verse 4 here tells us that at the end of days, there will be travel and an expansion of knowledge like never before seen. We'll move ahead here. Daniel, close up and seal the words of this scroll until the time of the end. At the time of the end, many will go here and there to increase knowledge. That's one of the reasons why I believe we are in the end days. Now, I know that the generation before me and the generation before that thought they were in the end days. Preachers during a Second World War were convinced that Mussolini was the Antichrist. I've got books in my antiquated library that attest to that fact. But we'll talk about this a little bit more in a moment. Things have changed dramatically in our understanding of prophecy from the Second World War. And a lot of that didn't happen until 1948. And things began to fall in order with the rebirth of Israel. You couple the ability to travel, the explosion of knowledge, with the restoration of Israel, May 14th, 1948. You couple that with the increasing discussion about an Arab or Islamic Israeli peace to be achieved. And I think you can understand why even non-Christians can see why we get excited a little bit about what's going on in the world around us. One of my regular sources I read on the internet almost every morning is the Jerusalem Post. I scan down through the articles that have been written. And it's fascinating to see current events from a Jewish perspective living in Israel. You see all these things unfolding around us. Daniel 12:4 gives us the general characteristics of what life will be like just before the time of the end. And by the way, that phrase, the time of the end, is a phrase that's talking about the end of Gentile domination. The Gentiles have been dominating the Jewish people since the time of Nebuchadnezzar, really. And the Gentiles really are dominating Israel today. You don't think so? If the Gentile country of the United States pulled out all support for Israel, Israel would be overrun like that. And so Israel very much is under Gentile domination today. And it will be until the time of the end. And in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 24, we were told just how long that Gentile domination would run, weren't we? A total of how many? 490 years. The first 483 years were completed at the time Jesus came as Messiah the first time, when He was cut off and put to death. And then there's this gap of time in between that we saw in Daniel 9:25. The time period we know as the church age. And it will continue at some point in the near future for the final 7 years. And at the end of the 7 years, Israel's sin and judgment and punishment for her sins of disobedience and idolatry will be brought to conclusion. That's why these final 7 years are so important for Israel. It will be the end of Gentile domination, as I said. Now, Daniel is told here that there will be an explosion of knowledge, and that would be a warning that the end is near. Now, verses 1 through 3, on the other hand, describe the end time for Israel. And if you go back to Daniel 12, if you've turned away from there for a moment, and these first 3 verses really describe what's going to be happening for the nation of Israel. The angel tells Daniel that there will be a time of distress, such as has not happened from the beginning of nations until then, in verse 1. Interesting, these words are the same words used by Jesus in Matthew 24:21 when He talks about the same time period, only Jesus says it will be a time of great distress, going beyond what the angel tells Daniel here. And so we see this unfolding here. Now, it'll be a terrible time of persecution for the Jewish people. A time surpassing even the Holocaust of the Second World War. Now look at verse 1 with me. At that time, Michael. At that time. What time? Well, remember that the chapter and verses in our Bible were not part of the original writings. They were not put in until the medieval ages, I understand. At least that's what I was taught in school. And oftentimes they were done on the back of a horse by a circuit-riding preacher riding along, wanting to make sure that the next place he preached, they would know where he was. And that's why sometimes you find verses in the middle of sentences and everything else. For those of you listening on tape, I was bouncing as if I were on a horseback in case you wondered what I was doing at that point. The tape did not warble. It was me warbling or something here. But that's how the verses come in. So let's find out a little bit about what that time is. Go back up to verse 44 of chapter 11 for a little bit of the context. But reports from the east and the north will alarm him. And the him here is the Antichrist in context. And he will set out in great rage to destroy and annihilate many. He will pitch his royal tents between the seas at the beautiful holy mountain. Now, the beautiful holy mountain in the Old Testament is none other than Mount Moriah in the middle of Jerusalem today. We know it as the Temple Mount. Yet he will come to his end and no one will help him. At that time, after the Antichrist has come on the scene, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. That's the time frame we're looking at here. Daniel 11:45 corresponds, as we looked at last week, with Revelation 19:19, when the Antichrist comes to his demise. We're told here in verse 1, at that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. In Revelation chapter 12 and verse 7, we saw how earlier, about 1,260 days earlier, about 42 months earlier, about 3.5 years earlier, Michael was involved in a war with Satan. And Satan is cast out of heaven, according to Revelation chapter 12 and verse 7. At that point in time, as Michael cast Satan down, John writes in verse 17 of chapter 12 of Revelation that the dragon was enraged at the woman. And in context, the woman is Israel. And went to make war against the rest of her offspring, those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So Satan, the picture is cast out of heaven. He's enraged and he goes after Israel and he goes after those who hold the commandments of God and he goes after those who hold the testimony of Jesus. He's one ticked character. And he's angry and he's going after them. And when Satan is thrown out of heaven, he energizes the Antichrist at that point in time. And I don't know if the throwing of Satan out of heaven is right momentarily before the abomination of desolation. It would seem like it might be, or if it's immediately afterwards. But the Antichrist, nonetheless, of the exact timing of Satan's being cast out, declares himself to be the object of worship in the new Jewish temple in Jerusalem. And the Antichrist, under satanic control, launches his attack at Israel. And the fascinating thing is, this is not just found in the book of Daniel. It's not just found in Jesus' teaching on the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, Luke 21, and Mark 13. It's not just found in the book of Revelation. Paul also references this event in 2 Thessalonians 2:4, where he talks about the man of lawlessness who is going to walk into the temple and declare himself in the temple the object of worship. And so all this unfolds right here at the same time. The angel tells Daniel, Michael will arise, and at that time your people will be delivered. Now, up to this point, this doesn't look like a really good story for the Jewish folk. And if it ended at verse 1, the first part of verse 1, you would think, wow, looks like curtains for the Jewish people. But Daniel is told that they will be delivered. Israel is going to survive. It's not just going to survive. It's going to be restored to a glory that would make what Solomon experienced and the people under Solomon experienced pale in comparison. The Queen of Sheba said of Solomon's kingdom, the half had not been told. It's impossible to even, in our imaginations, to build a fantasy understanding of the restoration the nation will experience when Jesus comes back again as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. The promise is given to Daniel that everyone whose name is written in the book will be delivered. And in verses 2 through 3, we read, well, let's just pick it back at verse 1. At that time, Michael, the great prince who protects your people, will arise. There will be a time of distress such as has not happened from the beginning of nations until then. But at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. But you, O Daniel, close up and seal the words of the scroll until the time of the end. See what the angel's telling Daniel? The message of Daniel is going to be closed. It's not going to be understood until the time of the end. Daniel, for 2,500 years, the book of Daniel, frankly, has been an enigma for people who've studied the Scriptures. For the most part. Oh, certainly the parts that were history at the time of studying were sort of understood. Interesting, last week in preparing for last week's message, I read that the Essenes at Qumran, who were responsible for the Dead Sea Scrolls, actually debated over if they could figure out the timing of the coming of Messiah from Daniel chapter 9. I was not able to find out exactly the details of their debating and what they concluded. I just read that as a comment by one of the authors who was studying the scrolls as they've been made available. But for the most part, for 2,500 years, Daniel has been an enigma, been hard to understand. About 100 years ago, the book of Daniel began to be understood in a greater fashion. Most of the commentaries of any worth have been written in the last 100 years on Daniel, as I believe God began revealing to His church what the future holds. And we see that as we come to this book. Clear focus has come in about the book of Daniel in the last 100 years. And I think it's because of a couple of things that have happened. I think in the last 100 years, because of the world getting smaller and our having a greater understanding of our times, that's part of it. But there has been an understanding on the part of Bible teachers that Daniel is not isolated from the Olivet Discourse, from Jesus' teaching on the Mount of Olives just prior to His arrest and crucifixion. People have understood now that Daniel is not a standalone thing from the book of Revelation. And I believe it's really been about the last 50-some years, from the commentaries I have read, that men have been taking Daniel, the Olivet Discourse, and Revelation, and seeing that they fit together like fine dovetails in furniture to present a comprehensive picture of the end times. And up until probably 50 to 75 years ago, this comprehensive picture was not put together. You say, why not? I don't know why not. It wasn't. But now we see how Daniel and the Olivet Discourse and the book of Revelation all work together. And I believe the reason that we see that today is because we are coming closer and closer to the end times. I really do. My great-grandfather's generation would not have understood what we know about Daniel and the Olivet Discourse and Revelation today. He would not have understood it at all. Because from what I have read, this bringing together, this comprehensive picture from these three major prophetical pictures had not been put together yet in people's minds. And for those of us who have studied it for any time frame, we say, man, it's so obvious. It wasn't so obvious. And if you're here and have not had much teaching in prophecy, you may be kind of still wading through the waters here, trying to understand all this and scratching your head a little bit. But I'm hoping that we're trying to make it clear and understandable here as we go through this. Let's continue with the context here from verse 4, where we left off. Many will go here and there to increase knowledge. Then I, Daniel, looked, and there before me stood two others. One on this bank of the river, one on the opposite bank. One of them said to the man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, how long will it be before these astonishing things are fulfilled? The man clothed in linen, who was above the waters of the river, lifted his right hand and his left hand toward heaven. And I heard him swear by him who lives forever, saying, it will be for a time, times and a half a time. You say, what a strange way to talk. But we know from an earlier passage in Daniel that a time, times and a half a time is, and if you look at your footnote in your NIV Bible or your New American Standard, it will say a year, 2 years and a half, or 3.5 years. It will be for 3.5 years when the power of the holy people have finally been broken, and all these things will be completed. Now look at Daniel's dilemma here in verse 8. I heard, but I did not understand. So I asked, my Lord, what will be the outcome of all this? And he replied, go your way, Daniel, because the words are closed up and sealed until the time of the end. So twice Daniel is told, in essence, Daniel, don't worry about it. You're not going to understand it all. He saw the vision. He wrote it down. He had dialogue with the angel about some of this stuff, but he still couldn't make sense of it. It was still a mystery to Daniel. It'll be closed up and sealed until the time of the end. Verse 10, as we continue. The angel says, many will be purified, made spotless and refined, continue to be wicked. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand. So if you're beginning to understand prophecy, God says you're of the wise. And that's a good thing to know, isn't it? Now, we come to verses 11 and 12. And I think verses 11 and 12 are probably two of the most fascinating verses in this chapter because of what they may teach. The word may should be bold and underlined. I'm not being dogmatic about this. But what is here is really fascinating. We know from Daniel chapter 9 that the final 7 years is divided in half, equally, 3.5 years both sides, and it is divided by that event we call the abomination of desolation, when the Antichrist declares himself the one to be worshipped in the new Jewish temple. This period of time is called 3.5 years. It's called 1,260 days. It's called 42 months in Revelation chapter 11, verses 2 and 3. And so we know that already. But I want you to notice what the angel says in verse 11. From the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1,290 days. Oops. I thought it was 1,260 days. Is there a mistake in Scripture? What's with this extra 30 days? But as they say on the infomercials, wait, there's more. Verse 12. Blessed is the one who waits for and reaches the end of 1,335 days. Why is there an additional 30 and 45 days, a total of 75 days at the end of the 3.5 years? 1,290 days, Daniel's told. What's going on with that 30-day period of time? Well, most Bible commentators believe that the first 30 days is a time of mourning. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 34 and verse 8, where we have the record of Moses' death, we're told that after Moses died, the people of Israel, the Jewish people, mourned for Moses' death for 30 days. And oftentimes, we will see mourning periods of similar length. But Zechariah 12:10 says, when Jesus returns, when Messiah comes back, and they see, referring to the Jewish people, and they see the one whom they pierced, they will mourn. And most Bible commentators feel that this first 30-day time period is probably referring to a national day or a national period of mourning for the Jewish people to realize they missed Messiah's first coming. And they will mourn the one they pierced. But you say, wait a minute. There's still another 45 days. What's the 45 days for? The commentaries I have, which I have a number of on the book of Daniel, speculate, and it's a speculation at this point, that the 45 days may be the time period that Jesus refers to in Matthew 25, 31 and following, when the nations will be judged. And Ezekiel chapter 20 talks about Israel being judged when Messiah comes back. And so there are some who speculate that the 45 days may be for the judging of the nations before the millennium starts, before the kingdom of Jesus begins. And so they would say that the 75 days, 30 of the days is a time of mourning, and 45 days is a time of judgment. Possible. But there may be an even simpler answer. This is what's exciting to me, and I think fascinating. I'm not being dogmatic on this, and I don't want you to ever be dogmatic on this. But I want you to see what unfolds here. If you look at a Jewish calendar, it is exactly 75 days from the time of Yom Kippur to Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication. Every year, it's exactly 75 days from Yom Kippur to Hanukkah. Now let's take a few moments here and let's talk about this a little bit and see the significance of this. Daniel, okay, first of all, many speculate it's the time of cleansing and judgment, the 45 days. And as I said, it's 75 days from the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, same thing, and Hanukkah. Hanukkah is known by the name of Hanukkah, Feast of Dedication, and the Festival of Light. Okay? John, we studied how Jesus went to the Feast of Dedication. And so while it was not a mandatory feast spelled out for the Jewish people, Jesus recognized it. We'll talk about what Hanukkah and the Feast of Dedication is here momentarily. Daniel 9:24 says that there are 77s are decreed for your people and your holy city to finish transgression, to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness. And I want to submit to you that Jesus' return at Armageddon very well may be on a Day of Atonement. Because that's the day the Jewish people's sins will be put an end to. As far as the judgment and punishment for their previous sins that put them in 490 years of judgment. And if Jesus returns at an Armageddon on a Day of Atonement, 75 days later would be the Feast of Dedication. And I think that's what is fascinating here. Is it possible that Jesus' return could come on a day of atonement? I think it's very possible. Today, the Jewish people celebrate Hanukkah as a memorial to the feet of the original abomination of desolation. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes in 164 went into the temple area and offered a pig and spread pig blood all over the temple area. And that is, in chapter 11, called the abomination of desolation. But Jesus tells us there's another abomination of desolation coming. Because in Matthew 24:15, almost 200 years after Antiochus Epiphanes, Jesus says, when you see the abomination of desolation taking place in the temple, flee Jerusalem. And so we know it's yet future. Would not the cleansing from Antichrist defilement and ushering in the reign of the one who is the light of the world be a very fitting fulfillment, a complete fulfillment of the Feast of Dedication celebrated by Jewish people to this very day? I think it would be a wonderful fulfillment of it. And the calendar fits it very, very nicely. Now, I'm not going to be as dogmatic as saying Jesus is God in the flesh and that we are saved by grace alone on this one. But I think it's quite fascinating that the 75 days are found very clearly 75 days after the Day of Atonement would be the entering of the kingdom of Christ, the millennial age of Christ. Now, it gets even more interesting. If the Day of Atonement is the day of Armageddon, and Hanukkah is 75 days later, the Feast of Dedication, that means that 7 years earlier to the day when the peace treaty is signed would also be a Day of Atonement. You say, why would the Jews sign a peace treaty on their most holy, sacred day, the Day of Atonement? This is where it gets really interesting, I think. Today, Yom Kippur is the most solemn day in Judaism. Even non-religious Jews, to some extent, observe Yom Kippur. It is also the most joyous day. It affords one the opportunity to rectify past wrongs and to face the future with a slate wiped clean. The Day of Atonement was to be the day when the sacrificial blood was to be taken into the Holy of Holies and sprinkled over the mercy seat on the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies for the sins of the nation that day. Yom Kippur is also a time of making peace, not only with God, but with others. And the rabbis have a tradition going back before the time of Christ, from what I have read, that tell the people Yom Kippur is a day of fasting. On the eve of Yom Kippur, they feast. It's a festive day. And the rabbis would tell the people, in essence, tomorrow we will make peace with God. And God has prescribed the manner. Today we make peace with our fellow man. And on the eve of Yom Kippur, I get goosebumps talking about this stuff, folks. I really do. On the eve of Yom Kippur would be the time that they would try and rectify disputes and problems with their neighbors and their families and those that they live and work with. Now, can you begin to understand what could happen here in the future? You do not have to be a political operative to understand how it could be spun, how you could spin the story, politically speaking, for a very powerful, charismatically driven kind of speaker, a world leader to come on the scene and to announce that as we come to this day when the Jewish people, on the eve of the day when the Jewish people would have peace with God, on the eve of that day when they would have peace with all men, what a wonderful day for us to sign this treaty between their brothers, the Arab, the Islamic people. The highest and holiest month on the Islamic calendar is the month of Ramadan. Most of you know that. You may not be aware that Ramadan always concludes exactly 7 days prior to Yom Kippur. And after Ramadan, the Islamic world feasts and celebrates. Do you see how politically expedient it would be for a charismatic leader to stand up in the world and say, we are bringing together these two great religions here in this treaty, and they are coming to have peace amongst brothers? You see what a great political opportunity that would be? But wait, there's more. If the peace treaty were to be signed on the eve of a Yom Kippur, exactly 3.5 years later to the day, guess what day it will be? The eve of a Passover. And I have maintained and speculated for many, many years now that the abomination of desolation would take place at the dedication of a new Jewish temple, probably on the eve of Passover. Can you again see the political, the photo opportunities? The new temple has been completed, and tonight we are dedicating this facility, and tomorrow will be Passover. The only glitch in the armor is at the dedication. The world leader who brought all this together to happen is going to declare himself, according to 2 Thessalonians 2:4, the object of worship as the abomination of desolation. It's fascinating how this might unfold. Now, for some people to look at things in this light and to look at the schedule of the feast days and the possibility of it being unfolded, they say, well, aren't you setting dates here? No, this is not date setting. It is not date setting, beloved. First of all, we have no idea which Yom Kippur, and we certainly have no idea when the rapture would take place. Now, eventually, people will know which Yom Kippur. When that peace treaty is signed, if people know their Bible, they will know where we are on this timeline. You know, Jesus took his generation to task because they did not know and recognize the signs of his first coming. In Matthew 16, verses 2 and 3, Jesus says, when evening comes, you say it will be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, today it will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. And Jesus took the people of his day to task because they didn't know his first coming, and they should have. They should have known he was coming on March 30th, 33 AD. If they'd studied Daniel 9:24 with understanding and clarity. But it wasn't clear to them. Partially because it had been sealed up closed. But they missed the signs of his first coming. They didn't recognize him in the things he did. And so here we are. We're not setting times. We're not setting dates. We're just trying to understand the times we live in, as the men of Issachar did. The fulfillment of Daniel's prophecies will take place. Take it to the bank. Fulfilled prophecy verifies the reality of Scriptures, and the clock is ticking. I love that line in Apollo 13 at liftoff. It's a great cinematographic moment, I think, as they're strapped in the Apollo 13 there, and they're on the launch pad, and it's rumbling, and they're shaking, and you hear the voice of Tom Hanks, who's James Lovell, say, "The clock is running!" And the clock is running down now. It's counting down. It's not counting up. It's counting down to that time when that treaty will be signed. Be it on a eve of the Day of Atonement or not. It doesn't really matter. That's my speculation. But the clock is running. The stage is being set for the beginning of the final 7 years. We don't know the exact time. Jesus said, no man knows all the details. You and I have one of the greatest privileges in history to be alive and ministering to what may be the terminal generation. Last night, Kathy said, that's a strange phrase, terminal generation. But it's very definitive, isn't it? There will be a terminal generation. And you and I might be the ones ministering to it today. I don't know for sure that we are, but we might be. We also have the privilege, not only of ministering to what may be the terminal generation, we have the privilege of being a communication link to the world of what God is going to do. Unfortunately, due to Satan's conditioning of humanity, the world doesn't consider this book and biblical Christianity to be worth listening to. And I know of only one way we're going to change that. Only one way. And it's not through words. It's not through the most eloquent of speakers. The only way we're going to change the fact that humanity doesn't want to listen to the Word of God today is we have got to be living a biblical lifestyle ourselves. And if there was ever a time when lifestyle Christianity was needed, it's now. When people see you going through crises in life, when people see how you deal with the struggles of life, when people see how you deal with the joys of life, they're going to look at you and they're going to say, there's something different about that man. There's something different about that woman. And they're going to come to you and they're going to say, how did you handle that when you went through that? How did you handle hearing you had cancer? How did you handle it when your spouse died? How did you handle going through these things? And the opportunity, the window, the door of opportunity will be open for you and I to share the message of God's redemption plan. And ultimately, as part of that redemption, is His return. The world doesn't need religion. That's the last thing it needs. It's got plenty of religion, doesn't it? Different kinds of religions. It needs to see the reality of Jesus Christ being lived out by you and me. That's what the world needs to see. Let's pray.